So I have a client commissioned to build two of these cabinets. And I figured while I was doing it, I'd talk a little bit about how to get a commission, how to estimate a commission, how much profit you make off of a commission like this, as well as showing you step by step how to build cabinets. So let's get started. So the first step is to take very detailed measurements of exactly where the cabinets are going to go and then write all that down so we can head back into the shop and do our estimation. So the overall dimensions for this cabinet are 13 inches deep by 37 inches wide and 30 inches tall. 30 inches tall is to the entire top of the cabinet, and you have to remember there's going to be a base and then there's going to be a top, so we can kind of subtract that out. And then that should leave you with roughly a box. That's going to give you the sides, the bottom, and the support pieces that connect everything together, as well as, in this case, I'm going to do a plywood top. So I'm adding in that plywood top too. And with that, we kind of roughly know all of the sizes of the pieces that we need to fit onto a 4x8 sheet of plywood. But to figure out if they're going to fit, I actually made a custom Excel spreadsheet tool that's going to help you with that. It's just a spreadsheet with each cell being a 1x1 square, and there's a 1 in it representing a single inch. Now, to use this, I like to just measure out, in this case, 13 across, and then carry that down to 37 inches. That's going to give me my top pieces, and I just color that all in. Now, I do that for every single one of my parts, and if it all fits on a single sheet of plywood, well, that means you only need one piece of plywood. Now, if you like this tool, there's a link to it down in the description, and it's completely free, so go check that out. But once that's done, we need to estimate now the hardwood. For that, it's really some pretty simple parts. We need a face frame and doors, and that's pretty much it. So we already know the size of the face frame. It's the size of the cabinet box, 37 inches across and 26 inches tall. For the doors, we're going to estimate it with those same exact measurements, and it's a little bit bigger than we need, but that's okay because we're going to have some waste. 37 for the pieces that will go across the top and the bottom. We only need 2 of those per cabinet. And then for the stiles, the pieces that go up and down, we actually need to add in an additional stick. So we're going to have 6 of those, but those are all going to be about 25 inches. We add up all of those measurements and we get 336 inches. You divide that by 96, which is 8 feet, and you get 3.5 8-foot boards that are roughly 4 to 5 inches wide. That gives me a general ballpark. So when I get to the lumberyard and I find a 7-inch board or a 12-inch board, then I can adjust. So let me head off, get that, and we can get started breaking down our plywood. So now that we have a plan, let's head out in the shop and start making the cabinet boxes. But rather than bring the whole spreadsheet, I like to just make this little cut list so I can keep track of all my pieces and check them off as I make them. So I like making cabinets out of plywood because there's very little work that goes into preparing the wood, since it's already a consistent thickness and ready to go to be turned into panels. But man, this stuff is a pain to move around. So if you don't have a lot of in-feed and out-feed support and a pretty big table saw, I would suggest just laying this stuff down on the floor on some scrap wood and cross-cutting it to roughly the dimension that you need, and then bringing it to your other tools to bring the final dimension. But since I have a big table saw and superb outfeed support, I'm ripping all my parts first, starting with all of the thick pieces and then making my way to the thinner pieces once I have them checked off my list. And now it's time to cross-cut everything to final size, and for that I'm going to use a miter saw with a stop block. But before we get there, I have a tip. You always want to trim the end of a board off, usually to square it up, but in the case of plywood, the ends can have either no veneer or it can be thinner, so trimming back a little bit ensures that the veneer is a little bit thicker here and you won't risk sanding through it later. But before we have to worry about sanding, it's time to set up a stop block. Now, anytime you can use a stop block, do it. The alternative is measuring, marking, and cutting each part individually, but that's really easy to mess up a little bit, make your parts just slightly different sizes. This way, they will all be identical, which is extremely important for cabinetry since so many parts are exactly the same size. But for these tops, they were slightly too wide for the miter saw, so I had to finish them by hand, but the rest cut no problem. And if this panel was any wider, well, you can use a different method where you just flip the part over and finish the cut on the other side. But with that, everything is checked off the list and ready for assembly. During this process, I want you to take note about how I use the bench as my flat reference surface, and I push everything into it to make sure that they are all lined up. But other than that, this is really pretty straightforward. Any part that touches another part gets glue on it, but glue alone is not enough. It's always good practice to put some type of structure across a wood joint. Now, technically, the glue bond is stronger than the wood itself, but if you rely only on glue and something stresses that joint to the point that it fails, it's going to fail catastrophically. But if there's screws or dowels or something that goes across the joint, then those fasteners would need to break for that whole joint to fall apart. So it's a little bit of an insurance policy. Now you can see I've clamped my parts together for about half an hour, and I'm coming back and adding some screws. If you don't have clamps long enough, you can skip this step and just sink the screws straight in, but I have them, and I find that it works a little bit better to have the glue firm up, and it helps avoid parts slipping around on me. And you can also use some kind of hidden screw system like pocket holes, but these cabinets are going to go in between two walls, so you'll never see these anyway. But just like that, the cabinets are together, and it's time to move on to the hardwood portion of the project. This white oak is actually pre-milled and could be used as is, but I'm going to run them through the planer just to clean up the surface and bring them all down to a consistent thickness. But if you don't have one, don't worry, you could totally skip this step and move on to making the face frame. The modeled face frame is close to the measurements we need, but I always like to base things in reality, and in reality we need the sides to be wide enough to cover the gap between the wall and cover the plywood and have a 1/2 inch overlay into the cabinet. First, I'm ripping the rest of the pieces to width, and then I'm going to take the outside vertical pieces back to the saw once the blade is set to 45 degrees so I can take a cut on the outside. This isn't completely necessary, but I'm doing this to make my life easier down the road when I need to scribe the faces to the wall. This way I have less material I need to remove in the scribing action, and it'll be a little bit easier and faster to do the install. And now it's time to put the face frames together, and no fancy joinery here, I'm just going to use some pocket hole. I have one in Craig's smaller jigs, which works just fine if you're not planning on doing tons of pocket holes. I do find this jig can slip a little bit when you're doing the drilling, so I like to lock everything in the vise, and that way I get better results. But while I do that, I didn't tell you how to determine the top and bottom rail lengths for the face frame. I mentioned the faces will hang into the cabinet by 1/2 inch on each side, and that's so that there's clearance for the hinges, but it makes the math easy. Just measured the inside of the cabinet, subtracted 1 inch, and there was my number. It's time to stick these face frames together, and I'll share the main reason why I don't use pocket hole screws for most of my work. They tend to push parts around as you drive the screws in, which can cause your face frame to have gaps and go out of square. So to prevent this, I put on a lot of clamps, lock everything down, and then I drive the screws in to make sure that nothing moves during assembly. And now the face frame is going to tell us how big to make each of the doors, which is the next piece of this puzzle. And honestly, the doors are the hardest part of making a cabinet. More than once, I have made doors the wrong size. So I am going to try to help you out so you don't make the same mistake with a formula that I have figured out that will help you nail the size of your doors on your first attempt. The hardest part is figuring out the rail lengths, which are the short horizontal parts. And here's the formula, which is also in the description, but we'll walk through my cabinet as a practical example. The first step is to measure the inner width of the face frame, which in my case is 34 inches. Then you add the overlay, which can be found on either the instructions that came with your hinges or printed right on them, like mine. Next, you subtract out the 2 stiles, since those will take up some of the space in the opening. Now, you might not have these cut yet, but you can measure your stock and determine what you rip them to. And in my case, my boards were just under 4 inches, so I went with 1 3/4. And the final step is to determine the groove depth, which is typically between 1/4 inch and 1/2 inch, and I like using 3/8. From there, you just solve the problem to get your final length that you need for your rails, which in my case ended up being an even 15 inches. And for the styles, that vertical part, you can make it whatever you want. In my case, I want the doors to line up with the bottom of the face frame and then overlay the top by about 1/2 inch. So I just took that measurement and I was ready to start cutting all the pieces. With all the parts ready, the next step is to cut a groove in the inside of the doors that will hold the panel. So I switch my blade out for a flat ground blade so the groove has a flat bottom, then set it to 3/8 inches high. Then to locate the center of the board, I just make a mark near the center and then put the blade roughly at that mark. You don't have to be perfect here, you just want to be close because you're going to take one pass and then spin the board around and take a second pass on the other side, which is going to center your groove. Now after I've run all of my parts through on the first pass, I head over to the plywood to see if it fits, and hopefully it doesn't, which is good. You want to sneak up on the fit. So I'll go back over to the table saw, just bump the fence a little bit closer at a time, take the 2 passes to keep that groove centered, and keep checking until it does fit, and then you can rip the rest of your pieces. With grooves all done, it's time for the joinery. We're going to use that same blade so the tenons are also flat, which is extremely important when you're making cabinet doors. So I set the blade to be the exact same height as the groove of the tenons and then use a test piece to make sure that I get everything right. From there, I just use a stop block and cut all the tenons, slowly chipping away at the wood until they're all done. Now, tenons are critical. If they aren't flat and if they aren't parallel, they're gonna throw the doors off. Then your doors won't be flat, and if that happens, you have to remake them. And that's why I recommend using a flat ground blade, which used in combination with a crosscut sled ensures that everything stays perfectly flat and you don't have any ridges left behind by a combination blade that would need to be cleaned up by hand later. That cleanup can easily throw a tenon off and ruin a door. But since I didn't mess up a door, I can cut the center panels. And to do that, I need to know how big to make them. So I measure the sides, see how long they are, and then subtract out both of my tenons. And that's going to give me the overall height of my panels. But I'm not actually cutting this to that height because the end of the board, especially in 1/4 inch plywood, tends to get pretty gnarly, like this corner here. So I ended up leaving it about 1/2 inch long so I can trim that off. And then I'll cut all these panels to final width, which is the exact same as the rails from earlier at 15 inches. I just subtract about a 1/16 inch from each of those measurements so these panels are slightly smaller than the opening. That way I have a little bit of wiggle room when I do the assembly. Now I skipped the most important part, which is to test fit to make sure that all of the parts fit and the doors were nice and flat. And they were, which makes assembly a breeze because I could with confidence add the glue and some clamps and let this sit overnight to dry. While I work on some of the final details like this little floor for the bottomless cabinet, I want to talk about something I haven't addressed yet. So far, you've learned how to plan a project, how to estimate it, you've gone through how to build all the major components of a cabinet, but what you haven't learned is how to get a client in the first place. Now, I will caveat this by saying I'm always in need of new clients, so if you need something made and you like my work, then hit me up. But I will share what I've learned over the years when it comes to getting new clients, specifically those who started off as complete strangers. And every single one of these types of clients found me through my website. And I know that because I always ask. And the typical story is they had a project in mind that was very custom and they couldn't find it in any store. So they went to Google and typed in local furniture maker near me, found my site, which has my portfolio, and it resonated with them. So they contacted me. And then we had a conversation, went through planning, estimating, and of course they gave me down payment and I got started. So my lesson there is you have to have a place to show off your work and where people can find you and get a hold of you. And if you don't have a lot of work to show off, well, then you need to make some. You need to make stuff for yourself, for your friends, for your family, so you can build up that portfolio because no stranger is going to trust you with their money unless you can prove that you can make the thing that they want to have made. But that's not the way that I got this project. This is actually for some past clients who I built some floating shelves for, and at the time I suggested making some cabinets for below the shelves, which I thought would really tie the whole thing together, but they weren't sure about that idea yet. And after living with the shelves for a bit, they decided that the cabinets were the way to go, so they called me up and gave me more work. And the lesson there is to always do great work and to nurture those relationships. It's easier for them to have a go-to person so they don't have to keep doing that search every time they want something new. And it's better for you to have that bank of clientele who will keep coming back because they like what you do. But don't get me wrong, it is hard to find clients. But the more you make and the more clients you have, the easier it becomes. So just keep fighting for it. But back to the build where I've just finished up making the feet and now I'm going to work on the shelf. Earlier, I glued on this piece of hardwood onto a piece of plywood and I'm going to trim it to size so that I can get it all installed. Now, when you're making shelves, you could drill some holes, use some shelf pins and make them adjustable, but I needed this shelf to be above an outlet. So there was no sense in making it adjustable because it needed to be in a fixed position. But I cut this shelf earlier when I was making the rest of the parts, so it's a tight fit. So I used that clamp to spread the whole thing apart so it was a little bit easier to adjust it. And then I'll sink some screws in from the outside. And now it's finally time to put this whole thing together so I can work on attaching the doors. Oh shoot, I didn't think about this. So when I was gluing the banding on these little partial bottoms, I forgot about the 1/2 inch inside of the face frame. So I need to do a little bit of trimming before they will fit. And speaking of bottoms, if you don't have a vise and need to do some hand tool work, remember you have the best vise with you at all times. Just sit on your workpiece and you'll be able to hold it nice and securely and do whatever you need to do. With those fitting, it's time to glue and screw them in place before heading into the off-script portion of the cabinets. Well, I guess the second off-script portion, since earlier I made some feet instead of a toe kick, but I did that for the same reason I'm making these face frames removable. One of the reasons my clients weren't sold on the cabinets to begin with is because they have dogs, and they were worried about cleaning underneath the cabinet, so they wanted to be able to take them out as needed, and were leaning towards putting a piece of furniture in the spot the cabinets will go. I advised against that since the gaps would look a bit unfinished and said cabinets built in would look a lot better and I could come up with a way to help with the cleaning needs. One of which was the feet so the robot vacuum could easily go underneath and sweep. But the second was to not permanently attach the face frames and instead use some keyholes in the back of the face frame and some screws in the cabinet face so the whole thing just kind of clicks on. Now, I mentioned this is the off-script portion because typically a face frame is just glued and nailed in place, but this is a little bit different. So you typically wouldn't do this, and I was honestly a little worried about the face frame not being as secure and steady as it needed to be since the doors will attach directly to the face frame. But with those tapered head screws, it pulls everything nice and tight, and it worked out surprisingly well. So after install, it should be as easy as removing a couple of screws, popping the top off, popping off the face frame, and pulling the whole thing out. But with the faces on, the last thing to do is to mount the hinges. I'm using some Euro style hinges, which are great because there's tons of adjustability, which is going to come in handy in a minute. And I won't deep dive into the installation because the hinges will have specific instructions as far as the spacing and drilling depth, and you can even buy a jig to make this process super duper simple. The trickiest part to install the hinges is to find the right spot on the face frame. Now earlier I mentioned I wanted the doors to go all the way down to the bottom of the face frame, and here's why. This way I can hold the door in place, line it up with the bottom, push the hinges into the frame, and the screws are already inserted, which gives me a little bit of a mark so I can pre-drill and install the hinge plate. And hopefully everything will line up nicely. Well, that's actually pretty common with these, but nicely, they have a lot of adjustability. This makes them go up and down, this makes them go back and forth, this in and out. So you can adjust them every which way, and they have enough movement to be able to get everything to line up nicely. And with a couple of twists of some screws, everything looks much, much better. And the next trick of these hinges is they clip on and off of the brackets, which is pretty handy for install because now everything's adjusted and ready to go, but I still have to take all of this hardware off so I can sand and do the finishing. So for this project, I'm using a pre-color by Rubio Monocoat, and I'm not sponsored, but I really like this pigment. It looks really, really good, but it is a pain in the butt to apply. It doesn't behave like a regular stain. It's like it's thicker and it doesn't want to get down into the grain. It tends to streak when you apply it, but you just have to keep on rubbing it and working it in, and eventually it looks really good. But for the top coat, I'm using a different hard wax oil, and this stuff is great. It's really light, it applies really easily, and you just wipe it on, leave it for 5 minutes, and wipe it all off. With the finish dry, the last thing to do is install the handles. Now the ones I'm using require 2 holes, so you need to be really careful when you're doing this to make sure you get your measurements just right. If you have a combination square, that helps because it locks in a measurement so you can repeat it on all of your doors. My next tip is to use a punch or an awl to create a little bit of an indentation wherever you want to drill. That way it doesn't want to wander around on you as you start drilling. And then use a drill bit slightly bigger than the screw. That way you can adjust just a little bit back and forth to keep everything nice and lined up. With that, all the prep work is done and we're ready for install day, which should go pretty easy since everything is planned and made to spec, and all that needs to be done is fitting everything in place. Or at least that's the theory.
So unfortunately, when I measured originally, I didn't take into account the baseboards, and I didn't remember exactly what they looked like. Turns out they're 5.5 inches tall, and I built these feet to be 4 inches to clear the baseboard, thinking they were about 3 5/8 or so. Which means the cabinet does not fit as is. Lesson learned, I should have just come back when I realized I didn't measure the baseboard, didn't make assumptions, but I didn't. So now I gotta back up, head back. I'm going to go ahead and just notch out the sides of these cabinets. So it'll slip over the top, notch out the back. Yeah, then it should all work. Hopefully this is the only surprise I have on this one.
All right, so when it comes to installs, nothing is ever easy, and it always takes way longer than you think it will. So here I decided to go with a quick and dirty method, which was to use the track saw to create a bunch of curved cuts, and I knocked out all of the loose bits. Now, it doesn't look the best, but this is all hidden in the back and underneath, so you'll never see it anyway. And just like that, the cabinets fit, and we're ready to secure them in place so we can start scribing. Now, if you don't know what scribing is, it's just cutting to fit. Most walls are not perfectly flat, so in this case, I need to cut the sides of the face frame to match whatever angle the wall has so that it sits flush up against it. But to reach the wall, I first need to notch out for the baseboard. So here, I put the frame in place and scribe it with a pencil that I put flat against the wall so it stays a consistent distance from the wall, which is the key to scribing. That way it traces exactly whatever the wall is directly on your face frame. Then all you have to do is take your jigsaw and just follow that line, and your face frame should fit just fine. And this is why you want to back bevel the edge of the frame, because a thick board can cause that jigsaw blade to bend, but a thinner board helps it cut a little bit straighter so you get a nicer, cleaner cut. And just like that, the face frame fits and it can be locked in with those keyholes and those screws, and we can move on to working on the tops. So this is pretty much the same process. You just put the piece in place, mark exactly where it's touching the wall, and then instead of using the jigsaw here, I'm going to use a track saw just because most of this wall is actually pretty straight except for the front. So I'm just curving the front a little bit by taking some angled cuts with the track saw until I get everything looking nice, and then tapping it into place.
So here's a shot showing the fit of the tops, but I'll be honest, it wasn't just a couple of cuts, it was about a dozen cuts on each side, slowly sneaking up to the final fit, which ended up being nice and tight to the walls. And then the last step is to clip on the doors, and this install is done. So I'll get out of your way for the glamour shots, but stick around for the cost breakdown at the end so you can see how much you could profit off of a project like this.
So it's the next day after install, we're back in the shop and I'm gonna do that full cost breakdown. So my original materials cost was $628. That was all of the lumber, the hinges, the finish and everything. And I ended up actually only spending $532. Now, I'm gonna add a little bit extra because I didn't actually keep track of how many screws I used and what was the cost per screw or how much glue and that kind of thing. So we'll add like $15 for those kind of consumables. I actually had a bit of a savings and that was partially due to a well-timed Rockler sale going on. So all of my hardware and the finish I actually got at like a 20% discount. So now let's take a look at the big portion of the cost of a project, and that is the time. So originally I said 25 hours in my estimates to make this project, and I ended up spending 39. Now, a big portion of that was because my original estimate, I didn't account for things like going to Rockler, going to the lumber yard, doing all of the estimating up front and all of the planning. So that was about 8 hours of the overage on my time. And then the rest of the time was just, I didn't estimate things quite right. And it took a little bit longer, an hour here, an hour there, and it ends up running you up on your time on a project, which is exactly why I actually do account for that. So if you took my total estimate on materials and my total estimate on the hours and multiplied it by a rate of $60 per hour, you would actually be about 20% short on the overall money that I charged for this client's project, which was $2,500. Now that 20% is in case I estimate something wrong, but it also goes back to the shop because electricity is not free, rent's not free. That 20% kind of helps cover all of that overhead sort of things that I have. All told, I ended up making a profit of just under $2,000 for the entire project, which honestly wasn't too shabby. So hopefully that whole cost breakdown and the entire video was helpful for you, and I hope to see you on the next one.